Somebody's got to say this isn't right, because everybody else is saying it's morning in America. You know, somebody's got to say it's fucking midnight, man.
Otis, plug it in.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, on what to me, if I were in Alaska, I would consider a wonderful summer day in the upper 70s. It's about 23, 24 degrees here today. And my goodness. So, if we hear some loud banging and clanging in the background, that's because, well, let me show you what they're doing. They are building, I guess, apartment buildings behind me. They've already blocked out the wonderful view I had of the television tower, this strange Soviet relic. They're not going to block out the church, but I just thought I'd show you what might interfere. It's been pretty loud. The other night they were using like a pile driver late into the night, and it was quite disturbing. Oh well, such is construction. So this is it. We're going to talk about how we got here again. This is episode 8, Underground in the 1980s. And this is the third 80s episode. And I guess a lot happened in the 80s. For me, the 90s were more important in many ways. But the 80s set the template for the 90s. And that's what we're going to talk about today, essentially. It seemed like 1 minute in the 80s, you had all these people with big hair and fluffy costumes and stuff. And then the next minute, it was all flannel shirts and Nirvana. Well, it wasn't like that at all, actually. What happened was something was underground that was bubbling up. And we're going to look at what was underground and was bubbling up. This is the 80s that doesn't get the nostalgia. A lot of people get nostalgic for all that superficial stuff we talked about last time. But this is the 80s that was bubbling under everything. Much, much, much darker. If we can say that the big hair and the the big movies and even the political culture war brewing was all the zeitgeist of the time. This is what Virginia Wilson in her book, The Secret Life of Puppets, calls the sub-zeitgeist, what's actually underneath, which in many ways represents the real world. If you look at the post-World War II era, for instance, the zeitgeist was things like silly songs on the radio, big band, smooth, easy listening music and such. But what was underneath it was stuff like film noir and EC horror comics, which really gave you an idea of what the times are really like as far as the darker part. Also in this, we're going to see the rise of tribalism. And I'll define that more as we go along. But for me, it's important to understand. For instance, we often talk about tribalism now between left and right. Well, actually, there's lots more different kinds of tribalism than that going on right there. But this retribalization starts really and comes in the 80s in a way it hadn't before. And we're going to look at that. So, first thing we're going to do is look at hardcore punk. What is hardcore punk? It's predominantly, and first of all, an American phenomena. Punk rock came to America and inspired a few bands in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, although New York City's punk scene had started way before even the British punk scene. But there was this thing that was happening. Also, some of it turned into this other thing called New Wave. I've discussed these things already. But by about 1980, it was clear that the punk scene was not going to be the dominant scene in the popular landscape. And what you saw instead was the rise of MTV. Some of the aspects of the punk scene, like the New Romantics, which were, how they connect to the punk scene, they do, but they don't. They are already a betrayal, certainly, of the punk spirit, although they take certain aspects of it with them. But they groups like, Culture Club, Duran Duran, the Thompson Twins, these kind of groups had some sort of visual flair that worked on MTV. But the actual punk music, that fast, loud, tuneful kind of stuff, and angry, sometimes rageful music, didn't get too far as the mass markets go. A lot of people think the Clash were a great punk band. I don't. I look at the Clash as being kind of sellouts to the kind of woke politics we see today. And even then, I was completely unamused when I saw them performing live at Bonds on Times Square. And they had they had invited Grandmaster Flash to play before them, and people were throwing cups and stuff at them while they were rapping with these turntables. And the Clash just came out and played their normal set. And even though they were all they helped pick the acts and everything, they didn't defend the acts. I heard the same thing happened with, I believe it was Peter Tosh, a reggae artist, one of the Bob Marley and the Wailers, the next night. In other words, they had these black acts come on before, but rather than defend them, they just played their set to what we call the Bridge and Tunnel people, because they had a hit called Train in Vain, and they weren't really what they claimed to be, which is a trend. But that's the mainstream. What is hardcore? Well, you know what? Hardcore comes from the rage and the anger and the sense of desperation and the meaninglessness that had been left to American youth by the year 1980. And in fact, let me play you a bit of a documentary called American Hardcore. This was made in the year 2006. This is probably your best introduction to what hardcore punk was. So let's play that.
Been going through one of the worst periods in music possible. Disco was at its peak. Rock bands were still big, like Foghat. Just crap.
Everybody was into this, like, well, we've got a shiny brand new car, and I just got my hair feathered, and oh, look at my clothes, and oh, here, want some cocaine, and we're drinking wine coolers, and just all that kind of crap.
For me, it was just so bored with what was going on. I mean, in 1980, we're still listening to the Doors and the Beatles, and we're supposed to be bowing down to that music, and it just wasn't our music.
They were all like formulaic bands, like Journey and the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. They're all great bands for what they do. It's just that when you hear it constantly over and over and over again, you're gonna want to just vomit or jump off the nearest cliff, throw yourself out in front of an oncoming bus.
As a boy, I'm coming up through the 60s, so I thought, you know, my late teens, early 20s were going to be the most radical years of my life, and I get there and it's, yeah, Pete Frampton in a kimono, man.
Time was slow back then. Things were barely moving, and this music just came along and just, it was like an electrical charge.
It was like a fucking comet hitting the planet. You know what I mean? It came out of left fucking field, dude. I had never heard nor seen anything like this.
The music that we were performing, the lyrics that we were writing had nothing to do with about holding hands and smiling and skipping off into the sunset.
I couldn't fucking resist this incredible scene being under my fucking doorstep, you know, full of hatred for mainstream normalcy, just like I was. I mean, it was just like, fuck it, I'm diving in. I don't care if I ever come back up again. And it took a good long while.
We'd been made all these promises. You go to school, you do your homework, you go to college, you get a great job, you make lots of money, you get married, you have a couple of kids, dog, cat, goldfish, two-car garage, and that's just not the way that it is.
Somebody's got to say this isn't right, because everybody else is saying it's morning in America. You know, somebody's got to say it's fucking midnight, man.
I'm working Monday through Friday, here comes Friday night, and I'm just going to go off. I hate my boss, I hate the people that I work with, I hate my parents, I hate all these authoritative figures, I hate politicians, I hate people in government, I hate the police. You know, everybody's kind of pointing the finger at me, everybody's picking at me, everybody's poking at me, and now I have a chance to be with a bunch of my own type of people, and I have a chance to go off, and that's basically what it was.
To me, punk was the portal. It was the portal to the counterculture. That's where I belong. That's where I live. That's how I got there. But punk rock at that time was becoming more associated with just the Sex Pistols and Sid Vicious. And Sid Vicious was, you know, he was a junkie, nihilistic junkie, and we were not. So we really were trying to carve out our own place. And we said, no, we're hardcore punk. That's, you know, hardcore punk.
We started calling it hardcore. Okay, like, you know, like as far as being like hardcore porn, it means it's like, it's right down to the core, it's the real deal.
I could never be Gene Simmons or Ace Frehley or in some band where, you know, we were spitting out fire and there's explosions, and I couldn't play like Eddie Van Halen. I still can't. And there's this new sound comes along, and it's, you know, simple but aggressive.
I guess the whole new wave thing was going on, and it was just kind of sickening tell you the truth.
Then you started having, you know, all these, like, all the, what they used to call skinny tie bands, all the day glow bands, because they were all wearing those neon colors.
When hardcore came out, I was a little kid and I had missed out on, you know, the 77 punk thing, and I wasn't around for the 70s rock thing. So here was something that was happening that was new, that we were making up as it went along. We were making the rules up and creating this sound, and the bands and the people around. When the scene was small enough, it was exciting. It was like you were on the cusp of something that was just, you didn't know where it was going to go.
Normal people did not listen to hardcore, and we liked it that way, right? Because you can listen to that shit. You can listen to Fleetwood Mac. Go listen to that shit. We are not going to abide it. We're about blowing all of that up. We're about destroying everything in that. And you can't live our way unless you cross that divide.
Did I mention that this was going to get intense? Yeah, hardcore. It's like this eruption. It's like a tuneless punk. It was just like chants. It was like anger. It was like, you know, just like the mosh pit was a place where fists flew and there was beer on the ground and people were breaking bottles, and it was just chaos. But it was a chaos that I'm convinced was out of desperation, a philosophical desperation. And also, as America entered the 80s, Ronald Reagan was elected. One of the things that most hardcore punks hated was any sign of the Reagan government. And they tended to look at any sign of returning to any sort of normalcy, which included the hippie world as well, as being something they couldn't stand. Let's watch this clip.
In the early 80s, there was a sense of reestablishing the order. You know, the white man, the Ronald Reagan white man order is coming back. You know, you'd had that wimp Jimmy Carter talking about peace and human rights and all this other shit. And you'd had, you know, the feminists and the Negroes and they're all getting uppity on us, right? So we're going to reinstitute order here, right? And so the whole country goes into this really puerile 50s fantasy where they're dressing in these cardigan sweaters, and we were just like, fuck you. Fuck you. Not us. You know, you can take that and shove it up your ass.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. And will, to the best of my ability. And will, to the best of my ability. Preserve, protect, and defend. Preserve, protect, and defend. The Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States. So help you God. So help me God.
Punk rockers loved to hate Reagan worldwide. Songs were written, posters were made, signs were raised, and oranges were hurled.
Every punk rock band of that era must have had at least one or two posters where they'd have the picture of Ronald Reagan from the Killers with the gun like this, right? You know, with that look on his face type thing, like, I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker.
You're fucked up, man. You're not gonna laugh. You're done that too. From the door. You're fucked up, man. You're fucked up, man. You're fucked up, man. You're fucked up, man.
Now, you might get the feeling from watching this documentary that there was a lot of political correctness among the punks. And you'd be wrong. That is to say that by today's standards, these were not politically correct people. One of the problems is, of course, this is being done in the year 2006. And whatever the people believed by 2006, they were reinterpreting their experiences in the past being that way. The truth is, were you to show up at any of these music concerts, yeah, there'd be kind of a leftist feel, but just as much an anarchist, we don't care feel as well. And so it wasn't about, these weren't the shock troops for the left. These were the chaotic youth who also felt betrayed by the left as well, although people on the left were trying to scoop them up. But consider this song by a group called the Angry Samoans. and it has got the simple title Homosexual. And ask yourself, this is a really short song, under a minute, which is typical of hardcore punk songs. They had to be super fast, super short. And ask yourself, what perspective does this fit into? Are these people, are they making fun of gay people? Are they supporting them? You know, all of our standards today. What does this have to do with it? And I think you'll find it slips out of all the categories and is something else. Give it a listen, if you can.
Screw your wife and get behind. Tell your kids you're doing fine. God, you know this stupid liar. Sucking dick, your pants on fire. Homosexual, up the ass. Homosexual, make it last. Homosexual, jerk me off. Homosexual, go get lost. Found out that your dad was gay, living life a brand new way. Last week you flew Howard Hughes, 40 fakes from the Jews. Homosexual, we love you. Homosexual, things you do. Homosexual, chilled and white. Homosexual, was it right? Don't like boys, you like girls, living in your faggot world. Talking shop with lawyers' wives, sneaking out to meet the guys. Homosexual, I'm ashamed. Homosexual, that's your name. Homosexual, where's the blame? Homosexual, I can't explain. Homosexual, we love you. Homosexual, up the ass. Homosexual, Darby Crash. Homosexual, make it last.
See, I told you couldn't fit this into your categories. So, related to hardcore punk was a movement in England called Oi, O-I. And this was kind of a working class youth rebellion music. It eventually becomes what we call skinhead music. Here's a group called Screwdriver, and they're singing a song called I Don't Like You, which the title could have been any number of hardcore punk songs. But they eventually take their style into, well, neo-Nazi stuff. And out of this comes this kind of skinhead image that we all understand today. That is to say that it starts in England, but mutates into America as well.
Give up working, keep on running ahead. All the people giving me honor, just making me easy. There's a working on beat now, playing in the rock and roll band, playing that rock and roll music. Who's gonna get it out of the market? I don't like you. I don't like you. I don't like you anymore.
In 1992, there was an Australian film that kind of reflects back on the 80s skinhead movement, and it's called Romper Stomper. And while they had these studio musicians doing the kinds of music that the skinheads listened to, again, a form of hardcore punk, they didn't invite the actual hardcore punks to make the music. So this song is called Fourth Reich Fighting Man, and you get the implications there of the third. And but what's interesting about this is that later other skinheads would take this song and make it their own, or even use the recording of the song because it was so close to being exactly what they did. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about goth and industrial music, which are on one level related and on another level very different from each other. Let's start with a band called The Birthday Party. Now, The Birthday Party, the frontman of the group was named Nick Cave, who is the same Nick Cave who became famous in musical circles later in the decade and certainly into the present. But listen to the vehemence. Now, here's the thing. This music is also not that far away from hardcore punk. The difference is, both of them you could call post-punk genres. The difference is that what Nick Cave is doing, and many people consider this his goth phase, although goth at this point was not a codified genre so much, and it wasn't a codified look as well. Nevertheless, he's singing this song about this alcoholic guy named Gun, G-U-N, and the name of the song is The Fears of Gun. And then he sings these lyrics. Now, I've purposely let this point play where you've got the guitar player and the bassist and the drummer doing this repetitious pattern, particularly the guitar player is going. Now, if you were to just simply try to play along with him, you would realize how hard what he is doing is, because you keep saying to yourself, well, are you going to develop this? Well, are you going to stop? Well, are you going to give yourself a break? And the answer is no, not till this thing explodes. It's like a ticking bomb. Meanwhile, Nick Cave is singing the following lyrics, talking about, we heard some of the hardcore punks saying like, yeah, we didn't write songs about love and skipping down the lane. Well, this is the same thing. Nick Cave is singing Fingers Down the Throat of Love. And then he gets to a point where it's like someone's got a grappling hook down his throat and he goes, love, love, and he's just screaming it. And, I don't know how you look at this now, but this is a real recognition of the loss of meaning. The existential dilemma. I mean, people these days talk about the meaning crisis like it happened yesterday. I'm sorry. You have to go back here. People like Nick Cave were much closer to the actual existentialist philosophers and the nihilists than many people are today who get these ideas in a more commercialized, postmodern, ironic form. But here you feel the loss of meaning. Give it a listen.
Yeah. Gun wears his alcoholism well. Finger in bottle and swinging it still. To sink and back again. The clock is going round the same. His busted clock, he hates its face. Just sitting and talking to heart it takes. The talking back to clock and slow and steady kicks.
For many people, goth starts officially in 1979 with the group Bauhaus, which is, I think, an important name to remember for those of you who know what that refers to. doing a song called Bela Lugosi's Dead, also an important name to remember. And in a sense, what's happening is these two things are coming together. The deadness and blankness of modern architecture with this Germanic kind of 1920s dark horror, expressionist horror aesthetic welding together, along with elements like Jim Morrison's vocals from The Doors, kind of just this, almost the empty sound of reggae, but inverted so that it's the treble rather than the bass that is emphasized. But listen to this, and this sounds very spooky, and in a sense, goth starts here. There are precursors, it certainly develops after this, but this is the real thing. Meanwhile, in other places, like San Francisco, things were developing in a stranger way. Now, one of the big differences between the European punks and the American punks and all their relatives and post-punk variations is that European punks tend to be more serious, tend to be more political, at least then, tend to be more philosophical. American punks tend to be more like the kind of people who are just, pop culture addicts. They hate what they're doing. They hate the fact they watch television all the time. They make ironic, jokey comments. Consider the difference between the Sex Pistols and the Ramones. The Sex Pistols are anger incorporated. They're rage, Johnny Rotten. There is a bit of humor there, but it's about this thing erupting. Whereas the Ramones aren't about the anger. They're about the fact that life is stupid. And so, I just want to sniff some glue, gabba gabba hey. It's ironic in a really stupid way. And that also categorizes the way European experimental music differs from American experimental music. So this is from the late 70s. This is a group called The Residents, totally ironically named because someone sent their demo tape back to them, just simply marked to the Residents at so-and-so. So they said, that's the name of the group, The Residents. They never showed their face. They always played with either big eyeballs on their head or, as you'll see in this video, try to find the members of the group here. And then there's another group from the same era, late 70s. This is also from 1979 in San Francisco, and they're called Tuxedo Moon. Again, very ironic name, very San Franciscan in the late 70s sense of the word. And we're listening to a song right now in the background called Midnight Stroll. And it has this, they put out one album during the time called Mutant Pop, and that's what this sounds like. It's like pop that has mutated and is corroding around the edges. And at a certain point, this kind of like doo-wop, almost like Andrew's Sisters kind of vocal comes in the back. But rather than sounding anything like a group of people, making a nice pleasant riff for your R&B song or pop song. It just sounds like as if it sounds like a dirge. It's like whoa, whoa, and so it's these things are mutating. There's another group from the time called Chrome. I would love to play you some of these groups. They did a whole album where 4 different groups did, for instance, versions of the song "I Left My Heart in San Francisco." None of them sounds particularly pleasant. But again, it's this experimental edge. And as you saw in the Residents video, there's something going on there that's never happened before. And that's what I find really fascinating about this period. And particularly the San Francisco music had this strange edge. Some of it borders into what we'll call industrial. Some of it is just strange. Meanwhile, in England and Germany and some other places, there was another new form of post-punk music developing. A post-punk music more influenced by the musical trends from the classical world, particularly the next group from Germany. It's called Einstürzende Neubauten. I hope my German viewers will understand what I just said, which translates into the phrase collapsing new buildings. And that is what this music sounds like. They would, before a performance, for instance, if they came to America, they wouldn't bring that many instruments with them. What they would do is go to the junkyards and find things to pound on. And they just started pounding things on stage. And there was another group, maybe it was Test Department out of England, but who would actually construct things on stage while they were playing. Blixa Bargeld is the head singer for this group, and we'll meet him again later in a different form. But this is from a German television broadcast, and they're talking with him. And they're playing in the large room in Nuremberg that they had built specifically to hold the rallies. And they talk about, are you here to desecrate this room, or what are you doing? And he gives his philosophy on destruction. Listen to it. It's very important.
Trieb hier der Teufel den Beelzebub aus unter Gefahr einer neuerlichen Mystifizierung?
Mystifizierung, dafür hätte man irgendetwas dem Raum hinzufügen müssen, was ihn seiner eigentlichen
ursprünglichen Zweckbestimmung entsprochen hätte. Aber das war, glaube ich, überhaupt nicht der Fall. Und ob es sich um eine Entweihung oder eine Exorzierung von irgendwelchen Hitlergeistern handelt, das ist eine Frage des Blickwinkels und der Seite, glaube ich. Weil die Entweihung findet für diejenigen statt, die ja den Raum in dem ursprünglichen Zweck sehen, und die Exorzierung für diejenigen, die eher auf meiner Seite stehen. Der Charakter von dem, was sie machen, ist auf jeden Fall nicht dazu geeignet, irgendeiner Überperson, irgendeinen Führer oder irgendeinen Faschistenkult irgendwie zu würdigen.
Musik und Antimusik werden bei den Neubauten synonym. Das Vernichten von Musik ist gleichsam Arbeit an der Musik, bis nichts mehr voneinander getrennt werden kann. Es täuscht sich, wer denkt, das Klanginferno läutet die Apokalypse ein.
Meine Vorstellung von Destruktivität trifft sich die mit der Walter Benjamin. Er hat mal ein Essay geschrieben, das hieß der destruktive Charakter. Der destruktive Charakter ist heiter und freundlich, er kennt nur eine Devise: Platz schaffen. Und da ist eben keinerlei unbedingte moralische Wertung oder keine moralische Wertung und kein Gut und Böse und keine apokalyptischen Hintergedanken mit verbunden. Kein Krieg und keine Zerstörungswut, sondern da ist eigentlich nur mehr die Notwendigkeit, wird dabei anerkannt, dass für alles Neue, was entstehen kann, erstmal die Vorbedingung geschaffen werden muss, dass das Alte beseitigt werden muss, dass dafür Raum geschaffen werden muss und dass dafür Destruktion eben notwendig ist. Garantiert zerstöre ich die Vorstellung und Erwartung von bestimmten Leuten, die sich etwas Limitiertes unter Musik vorstellen. Das war auch immer beabsichtigt, aber das trifft sich mit dem Raum schaffen und Platz machen genauso.
Blixer Bargeld als Bote einer neuen Musikphilosophie, die in keine Schublade passt. Auch textbezogen, eine lautstarke, traumnahe Poesie.
So essentially, destruction for these groups, particularly, well, he's very philosophical, but I think you can apply this to a lot of what's going on underground in the 1980s, is sweeping away the old. Now, on one hand, that sounds like if you're thinking about, what's going on MTV and, corporate America, the preppies, the kind of return to a conservative government under Reagan, they kind of mean that. But more importantly, they mean everything. That is to say, all of the old European stuff just has to go. Now, this has a particular resonance in Germany, and you can see why. They were poisoned by what happened when people claimed to be building a new world on behalf of old Western culture. But in fact, that was all a weird nightmare based on old Western culture, but it wasn't the real thing itself. And I think you can see this. There was a group called the Virgin Prunes in England, who was kind of a goth band with sort of industrial leanings. And they came out with a 10-inch album, 2 10-inch records and an album called Heresy. Now, actually, the band was out of Ireland, not England. And in it, there is, the music is not all that important. But what is important is the literature inside this little box set. And it has their philosophy. And in their philosophy, they talk about things like, the world has become too sterile and too clean. I agree. But then they say their answer is to create filth. And they mean bodily filth. They mean, at one point, they suggest, for instance, women should take their used tampon and put them in jars and leave them around the house. Things like this. Quite strange. Sweeping away the old. All those old ideas of what was etiquette and what was aesthetically pleasing all must go. And no one took this farther than an American performer named Diamanda Gallas, who arrived on the scene. I bought her first record, which included, was only 2 songs on a big 12-inch record, and one of the songs was called Wild Women with Steak Knives, and the other one was called The Litanies of Satan, based on the poem by Charles Baudelaire, who was a very important symbolist poet in France in the second half of the 19th century. And this should give you a clue as to where a lot of this is coming from. If there's a horror vibe, it's coming out of the symbolist era. And someday I plan on doing a breakdown on why the symbolist era is much more important to us than we realize. But anyway, she was operatically trained, but more importantly had, what can I say, really shady life. It was like, it just absolutely, reading interviews with her is a frightening experience. In fact, she is the only person in New York City whom I would see on any sort of regular basis that we went to the same little store that got our mail for us in Soho. And this was for several years, and I just continued always getting my mail there. There was an old Italian guy named Lenny who ran the place, and I liked just getting my mail there rather than getting it at the post office or having it delivered to my house. And she would come in there because she got her mail there as well. But she was the only person I just couldn't bring myself to talk to. I can usually approach pretty much anyone, but you'll see why in just a moment. This is Diamanda Gallas in about 1981. Someone who inspires and kind of awe-inspired terror. Okay, if you survive that, it's probably not going to get any weirder than that. But we will slide on different dimensions of weirdness as we go. So let's talk about the world of heavy metal. Now, heavy metal is a term that was used to start describing bands like, I think Led Zeppelin got the title, although they did about half their set was almost acoustic. Who was the other one? Black Sabbath. Usually, a lot of people point to them as heavy metal. You know, this loud, heavy, sludging, droning music with people kind of wailing over it. Basically, a blues-based riff that becomes super heavy and distorted. Well, and with lots of guitar solos. Well, as one could imagine, standard heavy metal, after hearing punk and hardcore and stuff, didn't sound so like such a big deal anymore. And so metalers did not take this lying down. One of the first groups to start to really change the way metal sounded was Motorhead. And listen to this. We would now look back at this and call this speed metal. What they did was they said, we've got to catch up. And catch up they did, indeed. They sped up the sound of heavy metal. Now, after speed metal comes thrash. Thrash and speed metal are basically cousins to each other, but thrash is much more violent and is faster. And whereas speed metal was reacting to punk rock, thrash is reacting to hardcore. And so suddenly everything gets ramped up, the speed, and also the skill of the players, because they have to kind of catch up with this sound. This is an early performance of song Damage Incorporated by Metallica from their great album Master of Puppets, which I remember this was a huge hit, and you could never hear this on the radio because this stuff was, it was selling lots of copies, but nobody would play it because this stuff was, again, it's all the underground. Later, Metallica starts doing power ballads, and, they played with the symphony orchestra at one point. In other words, they went down the route of success. But during this point, they were doing these concerts, but it was just, and look at the recording here, it's just like terrible, terrible video because, well, people were all using their camcorders back then, and the quality is terrible. So, but anyway, watch this. But it didn't stop there. There was another species of metal that would be called death metal that was born in the 1980s. A group like Venom out of England usually gets credit for being one of the first death metal bands. And it was part of all of this, a lot of this, although Metallica is America, a lot of this comes from England, where you had what was called the British New Wave of heavy metal. Let's listen to a bit of Venom, and you'll notice something changing here. Listen to the lyrics.
Metal fight, power and sensuous move. Energy screams, magic dreams. Satan records their best notes. We time the bell, chaos in hell. Metal for maniacs pure. Fast melting steel, fortune on wheels. Brain hemorrhages the cure. Black metal, black metal, black metal.
Dark, demonic. And in fact, it gets darker. And when it gets darker, it's then called black metal. This is from Denmark, a group called King Diamond, with the lead singer also being called King Diamond. Satanic imagery and such. What's interesting is, if you compare this devil imagery with, say, the devil imagery of earlier heavy metal bands like AC/DC. In AC/DC, you're fighting the devil. In this music, you're with the devil. this is a big change. In a lot of black metal, there's a real satanic influence, and I mean that literally as far as like, it's almost Miltonian, where the devil is the hero, the Satan is the hero because he represents rebellion against the conformity of the world. A lot of the stuff is extremely anti-Christian, misanthropic. There's a lot of not only Satanism, but Nordic paganism. And this is really important because Nordic paganism is also what happened, a big influence on what happened in Germany in World War II. And in fact, in the Scandinavian circles, members of one particularly ingrown scene started burning churches and kind of killing each other. And there's still a contingent of these kind of crazed black metalists today, but they purposely keep underground. It's remained an underground scene, but very powerful, and all this black metal went on to have a tremendous amount of influence to other metal scenes that developed. And in fact, let's listen to a song by one of the first Scandinavian black metal bands called Bathory, named after the vampire Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who used to bathe in the blood of young virgins, according to the story. And one of the things to notice is it's not just the wailing, screaming that you heard with King Diamond, but it's also this tortured voice, like kind of voice, which would later turn into the almost cliche, like death metal voice. So let's listen to this, If You Dare. And one thing you may be noticing by this time is that there is already a very tribal element to what's going on. So it's not just hardcore punks, but there's also the Oi movement and skinheads. It's not just that there's heavy metal, but rather, in fact, there's older heavy metal and glam metal and all this other kinds of metal, but then there's like speed metal and thrash and black metal and death metal, and eventually there'll be, I think the number is well over 100 genres of metal by this point. So what's happened is there's this tribal element. Why is this so important? Because we're seeing the breakdown of what had been a central culture. If you go back to the 1960s, even the countercultural stuff of the 1960s, people tended to listen to, you were either listening to mainstream types of music or you were listening to the countercultural music. And so you followed it all. People have often say, well, why are, Simon and Garfunkel are written about in rock history books? Because they don't sound to our ears much like rock music these days. Well, it's because it was all part of one movement called rock. I mean, there was rock and roll, but rock was more of an umbrella term for many more different styles that all came together. Acid rock and British wave and British beat music, British invasion, and the California sound, and all these things were under the heading of rock. And punk rock put a big division in that, but after punk rock, then suddenly everything just multiplies. So we've already talked about rap and the kind of new wave music that gets on MTV, the New Romantics, that sort of thing. And that's over, a lot of that stuff's in the mainstream. But what's happening underneath, for instance, there had been this Jamaican style called ska. Well, a lot of Jamaicans ended up in England. And so then there was a ska revival in the late 1970s, early 1980s with bands like The English Beat.
Gonna take you to a restaurant that's got glass tables. You can watch yourself while you are eating. Beer in the bathroom, I just can't stop it. Every Saturday you see me window shopping. Buying now interest in the rags and shells. Just 1,000 reflections of my own sweet self, 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 self.
Now, this lasted a couple of years and then seemed to vanish, but it didn't vanish. It went underground. And particularly in a place like New York or Boston, there were bands who were doing, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones in Boston, and New York City had the Toasters. Now, I'm very familiar with the Toasters. I used to work with them. That is to say, with all of them. We worked at the very large Forbidden Planet before it moved across the street to its smaller location, but on 12th Street and Broadway. And it was like 3 stories, 2 of actual store and 1 of warehouse. And Rob Hingley, the lead singer, was the manager of the store. And my friend Greg Grinnell was the trombone and other horn player in the band, and you'll see him playing. But let's, in fact, watch the Toasters. Now, I remember during those days, the Toasters, they were almost like a joke to me. It's like, you guys are still doing ska? Ska revival? This was like mid-1980s, 86, 87. Little did I know that this was going to go underground and come up again in the late 90s. Just very strange. And so now they're considered to be like this really important band. And I just find that really funny. Another scene from the times was the skate scene. Skateboarding was becoming something. This wasn't so much connected to skate punks yet, but it was starting to. But it was a whole separate tribal scene. If you were a skateboarder, you lived in a different world. I remember this one skateboarder. I never knew his name, but he was in New York City, and he had set up on St. Mark's Place and put these like barrels turned upwise, not laying over, but upwise, and he would like take off down the street and then jump over the 3 or 4 of them at once, and it was just like, whoa, these guys were in their own world. Let's watch a little on skateboarding here.
The lure, of course, is to defy gravity, hopefully with style, just like the skateboard pros do. 19-year-old Tony Hawk is king of the cult, inventor of such maneuvers as the 720, that's 2 mid-air somersaults, the Madonna, and the Frigidaire. Between appearances and sales of his own boards, he earns in excess of $150,000 a year. Skateboards have been very, very good to Tony.
Yeah, for me it has been. I bought a house, a condominium in Carlsbad.
The sport has developed its own language, which to the uninitiated sounds like dialogue from an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie.
I just like, stoking other people out, if you know what stoking means.
You know any?
Just go down to Venice.
Something happened in slide and roll curves, or... Sorry, bro, they're all secrets.
I'll buy you Chevrolet. I'll buy you Chevrolet. I'll buy you a Chevrolet. You just give me some of your love now. You just give me some of your love now, girl. I don't want your Chevrolet. Don't want your Chevrolet. I don't want your Chevrolet. Just give me some of your love now. Just give me some of your love now. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. I'll buy you a Ford Mustang. You just give me some of your love now. You just give me some of your love now.
Yeah, Tony Hawk went on to become like a legend, but he was already really well known and getting financial backing then. But again, there were these weird sense of tribes. Interestingly enough, in that last example, we heard behind it garage rock from the 1960s. I played that on purpose. One, it mentions don't want a Chevrolet, things like that. What do I want? I want my skateboard. But also because garage rock was an underground world. Garage rock essentially was the louder, more aggressive rock music that influenced punk rock in the 1960s, but it was washed away by the Sgt. Pepper's album, Beatles' psychedelic phase, the San Francisco groups, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, all of this stuff washed away the garage rock sound, and then it was revived by people like the Ramones and then the punks, but they treated it differently, as they used it as cannon fodder for a new style. Whereas the garage rock revivalists were much more interested in redoing garage rock, that is to say, keeping the tradition alive. Here's an important band from the Massachusetts area called The Liars. Jeff Connolly on vocals. I don't know. I'd rather listen to that any day over 99% of what appears on videos these days, because it's got grit, it's got an edge. A lot of this stuff from the 1980s, the underground, what sets it apart from the overground, and the overground is what's going to become our commercial culture today, but the stuff in the underground, what it has that so much music today does not have is an edge. And by that I mean something's at stake. It's not just people singing. It's like something matters here. And you don't have to sing loud music to have an edge. You can sing quiet music and have an edge. But there's a lot of edge missing in today's world because, well, for one thing, when people are sitting around looking at this thing and that's the source of their culture, you can't even have a personality. You're just a photo on an Instagram page. And another thing that started happening was that the garage rock revivalists and punks wanted to see the legendary garage rockers from the 1960s, most of whom who had, again, been flushed away by all of the changes of the 60s. They were the mid-60s, but the mid-60s were like ancient history by 1969. And who could remember Rocky Erickson and the 13th Floor Elevators in 1969? Well, no one. And Rocky himself hardly remembered himself then because he'd gotten too pickled in the acid. But he was brought out of retirement. He always was doing things. Rocky had a troubled life, but he was always doing things. But this is from the 1980s. He was brought out of retirement to do 13th Floor Elevator material. And nobody's got anything on him. Nobody's got more edge. No one's got more grit. No one screams better than Rocky Erickson. Absolutely amazing garage rock from a 60s icon who passed away sadly a few years ago. Another great 60s icon was Arthur Lee, but I can't go on and on and on talking about these things. But what that does show you is that the 60s were starting to make a comeback. Now, the punks had brought the garage rock, but soon the hippie music would start coming back as well as a new emphasis on hippies. But I would emphasize, in my thinking, well, we're about to see people called hippies in England. And there was a whole movement of travelers, of what would later be called crusties, crust punks. But basically what they are is neo-hippies. And the difference is that neo-hippies are missing an element of the original hippies. The original hippies were more connected to the folk protest movement. Then they took acid and everything got weird. Well, I've talked about the hippies before and the whole dream. But the thing was, most of the early hippies were well read. Most of them were not just drifting around. I mean, they did after they started getting pickled in the punch, but they had, I mean, you could talk to them, you know, they might have read Dostoevsky or Nietzsche or Sartre. You know, they might have read the political works of this figure or that. They might have read The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. That's the 60s. Those people disappeared by around 1970 or were, you know, it's like they got siphoned off into communes and such like that. But these new tribes, these new people called hippies, and I really never call them that because to me they're not. I mean, people think if you take psychedelics and you're listen to kind of old school music like the Deadheads. Deadheads are another thing that's the Deadhead revival starts about 1989. In many ways, it's more of a 90s phenomenon, but I'll deal with it here. Oh, okay. I've received a package. So anyway, let's watch, Deadheads. So, the Deadheads were basically reviving the vibes, I would call it, of the Grateful Dead in San Francisco in the 60s. And that's all they were reviving. They were not reviving anything like the 60s. And in fact, check out the colors of this guy's shirt. Nobody ever wore a tie-dye shirt that had that silly blue color in it. Why? Because this is professionally made. Someone takes a certain color shirt, then tie-dyes it. The stuff in the 60s was never professionally made. It was always homemade. It was always with whatever material you had. And lots of the stuff, you had like bleached out jeans. I did that a few times. In fact, I did some house painting as a kid and just left the paint on because it was cool. But let's watch a little bit of what was happening in England, because this becomes very important. There were these traveling groups who would then go to concerts. There's the Treewargy concert, where, again, it's these people going to kind of have a rock festival a la 60s experience. Same with Stonehenge. Stonehenge becomes very important to these people because they're connecting. See, what's happening is there's this other thing, the neo-pagan stuff, which was just kind of coming up in the 60s, but actually Eastern religion was much more prevalent in the 60s. But this neo-pagan stuff, it's everyone's saying like, we have to get to Stonehenge, we have to get to Stonehenge. Not realizing that, hey, Stonehenge is being ruined by all the tourism, especially this kind of tourism. So let's watch these news channels talking about the new hippies.
Dozens of hippies have appeared in court after violent clashes with police early today at Stonehenge. Altogether, there were more than 60 arrests and 10 people were injured, including 8 policemen. The trouble started when about 200 hippies tried to reach the part of Stonehenge where the summer solstice was being celebrated. Tonight, the local Conservative MP, Robert Key, said it was time to blow the whistle on this senseless annual punch-up.
The hippies say they believe in peaceful coexistence. The peacemakers among them, though, were simply brushed aside. For a few, this seemed to be what they'd come for. They can't even have hoped to win. Some got through to taunt the police, some tried and didn't make it. Most of them didn't even try.
Interestingly enough, this neo-hippie thing kind of relates to another, what seems very vastly different phenomena, and yet is very similar, and that is the birth of the raves. There was, I believe it was 1987 in Manchester, or what they called Madchester. The second summer of love, they called it. But what was it all? It was like DJs playing electronic music. Here's we'll do a little bit of a survey of this scene, and so we're going to go into now. What would happen was they would have these raves. In the beginning, raves were always illegal parties. You would take over, a particularly good place to take over would be an industrial building. And then you would somehow connect to a power source, maybe illegally. Then you would send out invitations, and then people would come and be all very surreptitious. And then people would be on MDMA or, ecstasy. They would be, taking stuff. Acid itself didn't make so much of a comeback yet, although some of it did. And we'll talk about how acid did come back through the back door in a bit. But essentially, it was this place where people would just ritualize this behavior. Although watching these people, I'm sitting there saying to myself, they think they're having a much better experience than I can see that they have. That is to say, they just seem to be, who knows how to dance anymore? That's the big problem. Now, what had happened was there was a disco scene. And you remember the late 70s disco. Well, that became kind of a joke, but it never really went away. What happened was in the post-disco world, the elements kept getting stripped down until finally, along with some of the techniques that the rappers had developed in their turntablism, they were starting to just play repetitious motifs over and over, or even finding blank. I have many flip sides to early 80s dance records that are just rhythms and such. And so they would find these things. with the advent of more digital equipment and stuff, you started getting more of just this repetition. You can hear it in Little Lewis's piece that we're about to play called French Kiss, which also adds a woman's rather obvious moaning as part of it. It's a very long piece, but I've played a little bit of the end of it here. And then we'll go into watching what's going on in England. So what had happened was that in places like Detroit, this new music was born out of post-disco, and it was called house music. And it was primarily this really repetitious dance music, and it eventually turns into this electronic music. And the kind of electronic music that still exists, that people go dance to. And to me, the issue with electronic music is you're now at the point where the melody has almost no point. And if you're in a room with huge speakers thumping, you can't help but move with it. And so it becomes a kind of an empty ritual experience for people who want meaning, but really have no idea where to look for it. We'll see more about raves when we get to the 1980s. So let's go back to the hardcore scene. By Reagan's second inauguration, the flies were in the ointment. Let them explain.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
Will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Reagan won the first time. It was almost like unbelievable. Something could be, how could this be? Then the second time he won, it was very disillusioning for myself. You know, those first 4 years of punk rock for me, 80 to 84, was all this hope. And then after that, got cynical. And punk rock fragmented into many, many, many different scenes.
A lot of the people who had started this local music scene in 1979 and 80 had become a little bit disillusioned. You know, the baby was no longer cute.
85, 86 was a total decline of the punk rock scene.
And then everybody who started the scenes all left it, one by one by one by one.
I came in August of 81, and I'd say by the end of 85, it was over. These people were not like sheep. They were not like heavy metal sheep that would go see their band, their spandex pants band, over and over again. They could turn on you. And chances are, in a 3-year period that you're into it, they're going to get disinterested. Or your time was up, whichever's first. So basically, the time was up.
You might think like, well, yeah, but you really checked out on hardcore. I never fucking checked out. Hardcore checked out, not me. Like for me, the violence was stupid. It just became stupid, and I saw my own role in the stupidity. In 1984, I remember it was the Minutemen show. It was the last time I punched somebody. The guy hit my brother, and I punched him, and I thought, that's the end of that. I'm done. And I felt like the violence had become too central. And it was clearly alienating to most people. It was ridiculous. So I thought, like, I'm out. I'm out of this. And a lot of my friends were out of it, too. They were like, this sucks. It was a bummer.
I think that was kind of the end of that era of hardcore.
The last ever Black Flag show that I acknowledge happened in 1986 in Detroit at Greystone. It's a hall. Weeks later, I'm in DC visiting friends and family, and Greg called me at my mom's house where I was kind of camping out, and he said, I'm just calling to tell you that I quit Black Flag. I go, but it's your band. And he goes, well, I quit. I went, okay. And that was it.
I decided in 1986, it's like, no, it's a good time to stop now. Black Flag was left without the culture around it. It was back to where we started.
I will actually be the first punk or whatever person in the scene say punk is dead.
It was over a long time ago. It's over, okay? Go home. Your cage is clean.
Now, hardcore never quite disappeared as much as it became more, what shall I say, ritualistic, so that only a certain kind of people would be involved with it. I'm sure if one looks for the certain kinds of punk performances today, one can still find them. But in the late 70s again, 79, a very crucial year because so much seemed to be ending and starting that year. There was a scene called No Wave in New York City with bands like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, who Teenage Jesus was a girl named Lydia Lunch. Let's listen to her sing. Well, saying is probably the wrong word now, isn't it? And that's not an accident. This was music. This is very egalitarian music for people who don't even play instruments. It's just essentially rhythms made by people who have no musical background whatsoever, playing and just, but there's a sense of real despair and noise. The noise is very important. Now, there were several other bands in the late 70s, early 80s, the Contortions and DNA and I think another one's Mars. And then there was a group called the Swans. Now, the Swans was a dark, sludgy affair. This was not heavy metal. This was not punk rock. This was something else. The only word we could have for this today is this is noise. But listen to the dark, despairing intensity of it. And then there's the Butthole Surfers. Even the name tells you we're somewhere else. Yeah. And eventually, in the late 90s, they actually had a hit called Pepper. And people had to say their name on the radio. But obviously, with a name like that, their basic thought was not success. But it was outrage. It was humor. Dark, ironic, postmodern humor. The Butthole Surfers, well, let's watch a moment of them first.
Ain't no kind of sexual feeling that I would not, should not, I could not do. See this right here. I'll be going down to Florida way. You know that I'm going to have to potty train the chairman Mao. Make the governor write my doo-doo that child. I'm gonna brand me up a White Castle slider out of India's sacred cow. But I'm moving down to Florida way. I'm gonna build me the atomic bomb. Well, I'm gonna hold the time.
How was that? What was that? In the about 1982, 83, 84, everyone I knew in New York was listening to the Butthole Surfers. You'd see someone with a Walkman with their cassette listening to something, and you say, what are you listening to? And they go, Butthole Surfers. They were tremendously important because they were coming from Texas, but they had encapsulated the new mood, the mood which still gets us today, of complete ironic detachment. We could call this cool, but they were beyond cool. They were just insane. And Gibby Haynes, the main vocalist that we saw there, dressed in a dress, not to make a transgender point, but just simply to be, you know, like you see this sometimes in freak shows where they just put a dress on someone because it was simpler. Just an outrageous sort of presentation. In fact, I'm told that, and I couldn't find an example of this. Again, the actual video surviving material on this stuff is very poor. But they used to have a projector on the wall for some of their bigger shows. And they show stuff like penis reconstruction surgeries, farming accidents involving combine harvesters. They would show these in the background. They also encouraged everyone. Evidently in Texas, the whole LSD thing came later than it did in other places and survived longer. See Bill Hicks, the comedian. But they would encourage people to take mushrooms or acid and then go on a trip. And here is where it's kind of like they knew, they're showing you this imagery, they're doing these shows, they know it's going to be a bad trip, and they don't care. That is a radical change and departure. This has nothing to do with the 60s anymore. But what it is doing is taking an aspect of punk rock and an aspect of the hippies and welding them together in, shall we say, an unholy way. This is going to be the future, at least through the 90s. This weird mixture of elements. More Butthole Surfers, please. Now again, going back to the Swans, who were an early noise band coming out of the no wave scene, and what they were doing was almost ritualistic noise. You could tell that Michael Gira was just chanting and doing these strange things. Other bands at the time, two in particular, I have a closer relationship to. One is called Band of Susans. The reason they called it Band of Susans is because there were 3 different Susans in the band when they started, but Robert Poss was actually, and Susan Stenger were actually the main people behind the band. But here's the thing about their music. They were totally influenced by the avant-garde. That is to say, they were not just rock and rollers who wandered into play. They may have seen something like No Wave, but then they thought to themselves something like Lamont Young. You know, they thought something like Glenn Branca, of whom they played with, as did Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth. So that you got these people who were coming out of this, legitimate avant-garde with real musical training, but now they were using it to create this noise. Here's a little bit of Band of Susans. They were the only band I could literally depend on destroying my ears when I would go. I mean, I think once I accidentally did not stuff I would usually take some paper toweling and wad it up and put it in my ears. Once I forgot, my ears rang for days. I discovered something, going to too many bands, is that the bass notes do less damage to your ear than treble. And this band was all about 3 droning treble guitars. And it would just be like, oh. Band of Susans. And kind of their cousins, in a sense, were Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth became much more popular and well-known, but I would put them equal to each other in many respects. So Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore and Lee Ronaldo were some of the people behind Sonic Youth, and they would do these long, drony things. Again, I used to find, Robert Poss and Susan Stenger were good friends of mine back in New York. And Thurston Moore used to come into the small record store that I worked in the early 90s. I was buying and selling record collections, and he was specifically looking for avant-garde records. So, again, these are not musical naifs doing this. These are people who are philosophically, pushing the boundaries. And let's listen to a little bit of some of the more chaotic sounds and intense sounds of Sonic Youth from the late 80s. And we're going to leave that there because it's through Sonic Youth, who we will hear again in our 90s episode, that we start to enter the world of the 90s. Another sign was there was a thing that started to be called alternative music, alternative rock. There'd be groups like REM or They Might Be Giants. And another band that was very important was Camper Van Beethoven. Now, just the name itself. Well, a camper van is a type of recreational vehicle. Beethoven is a composer. Camper Van Beethoven. Consider the difference between the names like 13th Floor Elevator, Jefferson Airplane, Moby Grape. Well, they kind of have a sense of humor to them, but there's also this cosmic kind of strangeness to them. Whereas Camper Van Beethoven is purely postmodern irony. It's like, oh, Camper Van Beethoven. Ha ha ha. You know, it is this ironic, and the band itself is like this. They played a variety of styles. You couldn't pin them down. But their most famous song, Take the Skinheads Bowling, which is very interesting because they were obviously talking about the neo-Nazis, but they were basically saying, you know, this would be a good way to deal with these guys. Just take them bowling instead of being afraid of them. And it's hard to imagine anyone on the left today saying this about anyone they can, and their expanded definition of what's fascist. It's hard to see them taking a centrist bowling, let alone a skinhead. Play it.
Everybody's coming home for lunch these days. Last night there were skinheads on my lawn. Take the skinheads bowling, take the
And of course, with all this crazy music, it was only natural that at some point someone would say, what's going on here? And the PMRC, led by Tipper Gore, what was it, Parents Music Resource Center or something like that, decided they needed to put labels on the records. And so they devised what we call the parental advisory label. And this ended up going on records. Of course, in places like Walmart, you can't even sell the parental label version of an album. So they would make the edited version that had things cut out of it. Same album, same music. And everyone knew what was missing. But what kids would do in the 90s is they would look for the ones that had the labels on them. So that the parental advisory label became the thing that kids looked for, of course. And that helped to create a lot of the culture of the 90s. But let's continue. Now, to me, one of the most interesting and fascinating, probably healthiest of the tribes of the 1980s was what I'd call folk punk, which has a slight prehistory, goes back to the folky movement, and there were people who were adding electric guitars and things to folk rock, like Fairport Convention or Steel Eye Span, or even in France, like groups like Malicorne or Trion. But these bands always kind of played the music very, what should I say? They played it very faithfully in many ways, almost reverently, almost too reverently. Whereas the folk punks just took, and you can see this with the Pogues, they're doing traditional Irish music, but just juiced up on punk rock energy and not being particularly precious with the material. I consider this a step forward over the older folk revival stuff. As much as I like the older folk revival stuff, it is in itself a bit of a dead end. Whereas the folk punk stuff continues to this day in different forms because it's got so much energy and life to it. It's a way of continuing the past without necessarily denigrating the past. And this movement, well, we'll see it in the 90s we'll see it more in the second half of the 90s. But let's listen to the Pogues. And Shane MacGowan, the lead singer here, troubled soul, but what a character. And their whole presentation was quite interesting. The Pogues.
As a girl when I'm touching out if I'm burning the sad loving your hand and I'm wondering
Another character that I don't know where else to put him, but I'm going to put him here. There was a musician who was a singer-songwriter back in the 1970s, but had more of a predilection for singing like jazzy songs as if he was a beat poet. And then suddenly, one day in the early 80s, he just chucked it all. Not entirely. He still did his old material sometimes, but suddenly changed his style radically and came out with an album called Swordfish Trombones, and that was Tom Waits. And when he performed live, there was this real sense of primitivism about what he was doing. And in fact, later, I would consider him one of the progenitors of American Gothic music, which to me is a bookend to folk punk, which is why I'm putting it here. Let's listen to a little bit of Tom Waits. Now, of all the people we're not expecting to run into in this section, is the person we're going to run into in this section. And that's Nick Cave from the Birthday Party. Last we saw, he had his fingers down the throat of love, and it sounded like a lot more than love was being vomited out of him. But in a sense, one of the things I liked, he also wrote songs like Big Jesus Trash Can, or another song, Sonny's Burning, where he goes, hands up, who wants to die? That's the, these are dark, despairing songs, or as he puts it, his Old Testament phase. But he said at a certain point he had to shift gears, and we'll talk about that shift in a minute. But I started noticing something in his album called The Firstborn is Dead. And what I noticed is that he was essentially starting to explore. He would do songs that were based on the blues, based on work songs, chain gang music, based on sea shanties, which I thought was fascinating. Because my feeling, and I remember saying this to a friend at the time, my feeling is you can't start by investigating these older styles without starting to be influenced by them, which to me was a very healthy sign. I had heard from a good friend of mine who met Nick Cave and said, yeah, the guy's a total junkie. He was shooting heroin. He needed something. And I was glad that he started to discover this, because I felt for me this was a way out of his dilemma. Let's listen to a bit of a live version of his song. You'll notice he's also changed the way he's dressed. That is to say, he starts to wear black suits, white shirts, and he's continued in this mode ever since. He had some sort of big change around this time where he started to look at things differently. But let's listen to a song called Blind Lemon Jefferson. Blind Lemon Jefferson, for those who don't know, was a blind blues singer who used to wander around the train tracks in Mississippi, and he would sing for nickels and quarters to the guys working on the railroads and such. And he put out a few albums, or at least albums worth of material. It was more like different singles on 78s. But Nick Cave discovered this and wrote a song about him. But listen to the mournful quality. You can't really appreciate this. I would suggest going and finding the album Firstborn is Dead. It is one of my all-time favorite Nick Cave albums. Take it away. But as I said, Nick Cave had said he was in an Old Testament mood, and at a certain point he said, I need to close that book and open up another book. And the book he said he was going to open up was the New Testament. This didn't mean that he was never going to do darker material again. But listen to this song that shows up on his Tender Prey album. It's called New Morning. Interestingly enough, who's in his Bad Seeds band? But Blixa Bargeld from Einstürzende Neubauten, which I find really fascinating as well. So, you have these characters who philosophically were so dark, looking for something more meaningful. And to me, these are part of the people who are pointing a way that other people, unfortunately very few, but other people needed to follow. And I once did meet Nick Cave. Unfortunately, a good friend of mine who seems to know everybody, Larry Ratso Sloman in New York City. I mean, friend of Bob Dylan. He knew Allen Ginsberg, knew Leonard Cohen, and he knew Nick Cave, knows Nick Cave. And he took me over where he's having a book signing. And I just shook Nick Cave's hand and said hello. Because I wanted to really talk to him. I wanted to talk to him about God, because some of his songs were about God. I wanted to talk to him about what he was thinking about life. But unfortunately, he had like 400 people outside of this huge tower record store waiting to sign his autograph. This was in the mid-90s. And I just said, I can't do this to him. He's just got too much, too much on his mind, all these people and such. It's just, this is not the time. So I never had a chance to talk with him. But I did meet him. That was a nice thing. Nick Cave, tell us about The New Morning. And tell me, doesn't this sound like gospel music? So let's shift gears entirely and talk about comics. Comics were an underground phenomenon in the 1980s. There was a big change in music in the 1960s. Then there was a big change in films in the 1970s. Why did it take a while? Because films take much longer to produce. And I think it took a while for the ideas in the culture to move into filmmaking. And then there was a big change in comic books in the 1980s. And why was that among the last things to change? Because there was a big change in the comic book industry, which was essentially run like a big jail for these illustrators in the 1960s, well, all the way in the past. And there was some buzzing and rumbling underneath from the underground comic scene, which developed in the 1960s through people like R. Crumb and Spain. And in the 1980s, suddenly these things are going to start spilling over into what were called alternative comics. And there's a whole range of alternative comics with alternative publishers. And some of them were more connected to the underground scene, which was quite scatological and sex-crazed. But some of them were more serious. There was also some of them were more cutesy. And so there was this, but then there was also the fact that these would eventually start working their way into the mainstream comics. And one of the main artists who brought the new changes to the mainstream comics was Frank Miller. Now we're going to watch a little bit of material about Frank Miller here, a little bit of an interview. His work is really important. And keep in mind, he was in New York City. Unfortunately, I never met him, but I did hang out in the comic book demi-monde. But this is from a documentary called Comic Book Confidential.
There are a very few, maybe only 2 or 3 comic book characters that have been created that have stood 5 decades of time and have been adapted 2 different times. With Batman, you've got a character you can describe in just a few seconds. Parents were murdered by criminals. He's warring on crime for the rest of his life. His motive is there. He looks great, and he is so simple in his design and in his concept that he's open to an incredible number of interpretations. He was created in 1938, I believe, and the character that was created then was just ruthless in his methods, terrifying to criminals. Over the years, that got softened because people started thinking that comics had to be just for kids. And once they decided they were made for kids, all of a sudden, Batman had to be made much nicer. And eventually, just no kid would relate to him anymore. What I've been trying to do recently is to take the stuff of the old comics and do it in a way that's worth reading from me.
Well, it's white now.
Whiter than white.
1,000 casualties.
Good. The fastest man alive.
But he's had insisted that every man. It is the White House, isn't it, dear?
Whatever stories I write have to do with my reactions to what's going on around me, with the world that I live in right now, with 1980s America, which is a very frightening, silly place. And it's often silly and frightening at the same time, and I hope Dark Knight is often silly and frightening at the same time.
And Miller would have a huge influence, along with another person. I'm not going to go too deeply into comics, but another person was Alan Moore, who invented characters like V for Vendetta. He invented the Watchmen. He was the writer, but not the artist. There were also changes coming from the punk scene. A couple of brothers with connections to the Los Angeles hardcore world were the brothers Hernandez, Los Brothers Hernandez, and they did a comics called Love and Rockets, and these were very definitely Chicano punk people in the comics, and it was but mixing with like the cholos and the guys and lowriders and stuff like that. Let's watch a little bit of I think this is Jaime Hernandez talking about Love and Rockets.
This is a typical day with Maggie and her best friend and possible lover, Hopi. I just gotta get a hold of $50, Hopi. You should take up Lucha Libre, Mag. Then you could give all your opponents the flying sit-down. What about that priest you told me about that used to buy you things when you were little going to that Catholic school? Brother Boris? Ugh, what about him? He's still at the church, isn't he? Maybe you could. Sorry. He's in jail for molesting little girls at the school. Speaking of molesters, what about Del Chimney? He's a slob, but he's always had cash stashed away somewhere. Maybe we could if he wasn't dead. Chimney is dead? Oh, gee. Yeah, Joey and his buddies found him in his house nailed to the wall. He had a lot of enemies, you know. My God. He was the first guy to ever put his tongue in my mouth. I gargled for days. Oh, great. We had to come this way. Oh, the pain. What? Oh, I see. There they are. Black steel-toed bomber boots on sale for only $48.50, and they just happen to be your size. Oh, Hopi, look at him. I just got Admiral die. You're really choked up about this. How come? You don't understand. If I can't get him, Daffy will get him when she gets back from her trip, who knows when. And she'll rush over to our house, parade him off for us, and talk about what a great buy they were. It never fails when I want to buy something real bad. So what? She's your friend. I'm sure she'll let you borrow him once in a while. Daffy's a good kid. Oh, Kaka, you have an answer for everything, don't you? Now, hey, wait, Hopi, I'm sorry, I didn't mean... Oh, Maggie, for crying out loud, I'm not leaving. Hey, Speedy! Oye, Esperancita, what are you crazy broads up to now? You gonna rob that store or what? Or what? Any of you guys got 50 bones you could lend Maggie? 50 bones? Por qué? For what she's drooling at that window. Aren't those just the neatest boots you've ever seen? Shit, they look like chalupas. Chalupas, chicharrones. Ah, hey, don't fuck around. You asked us. Ow. Huh, what do you know about fashion? That's fashion. Looks more like horror movie props. Ha. Yeah, well, at least I don't endanger my life in that bomb. God, he's so cute. It's scary, Opie. Yeah, well, that still doesn't get you $50.
Okay, let us continue. We talked a bit about films last episode in number 7 when we talked about the surface of the 80s and all the blockbusters and stuff, and how so much of it was genre categories. I mean, there was action and there was science fiction and horror. But now we're going to dive under the horror, because there was a brewing underground horror world, and it started off the decade as more like exploitation. By exploitation, I mean, well, first of all, that means films made to make money, period. Now, in horror, what that means is you got to use as much blood and as much sex and as much of just crazy elements. You got to grab people's attention. The really fascinating thing about exploitation is no one cared about making anyone feel good. It had nothing to do with political correct sensitivity. All of this actually came out of the carnival world in the 1930s. But there was an older school kind of exploitation film which existed particularly in the early 80s, and wasn't going to survive the decade. But let's watch a little collage of different elements from it. And if laughing psychotic deer heads on a wall bother you, you should probably turn away. Actually, this is going to be kind of disturbing.
Groovy.
You bastards! Why are you torturing me like this? Why?
That was pretty crazy. Evil Dead 2. It was almost his remaking Evil Dead, which is a really dark horror film, as a comedy. A dark postmodern comedy where the walls are literally laughing at you. Pretty amazing stuff. He would later go on to direct the first 3 Spider-Man movies. And another film, Drag Me to Hell. Sam Raimi is someone who became very important, as did his friends at the time, the Coen brothers. And that's something I should probably mention a bit of. They were also independent, but I'm not going to show you anything from them right now. What killed, however, the old school exploitation movie was several factors. One, drive-ins were drying up. Another thing, places like the grindhouses on 42nd Street were being shut down to prepare for the new Disney-fied 42nd Street. And then also the video store was changing things. So you had these direct-to-video movies. Now with the direct-to-video movies, you started getting people who were able to watch far more films than they ever did before and have more references. So that lent itself to more of this postmodern aesthetic. One of the first companies to really bank on this was a strange company called Troma out of New Jersey. And their first big film was The Toxic Avenger. Let's watch the trailer for that.
Meet little Melvin. He's a 90-pound weakling. Everyone hated Melvin.
I'm gonna take this mop and shove it down your throat.
They teased him.
I wanna do it with you. Okay.
They taunted him. They tormented him until he had a horrifying accident and fell into a vat of nuclear waste, transforming little Melvin into a hideously deformed creature of superhuman size and strength. Melvin became the Toxic Avenger, the first superhero born out of nuclear waste. Yes, the muggers and the rapists didn't know what law and order was until the Toxic Avenger came to town.
Why that is so different from the other earlier exploitation films is that it's absolutely self-aware. Much like the Killer Tomatoes movie that came out. These were, killer clowns from outer space, this sort of stuff. And Troma specialized in making these. After a while, you had movies that were just knowingly bad, whereas an exploitation wasn't necessarily knowingly bad. You could call John Carpenter's Halloween an exploitation film, and it's great as far as all the techniques involved. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, another illustration of a great exploitation film. Whereas this new breed of postmodern exploitation film essentially killed it. One of the films that signaled something new near the end of the decade was called Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Now, by the standards of, say, the early aughts of the 21st century, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is not that intense or crazy. That is to say, it doesn't have scads of bloodshed, even by the standards of many of these R-rated exploitation films. However, this film was given an NC-17, essentially not rated, and the film board absolutely refused to do it. And when you watch the film, you say, why? And when they were asked why, they couldn't point to a reason. They just said it's the whole thing. And the whole thing is dark in extremis. What's dark about it is the mood.
Otis, plug it in.
Notice how the television is used as a weapon. And the idea of the sinister television and the sinister video image is something that shows up more and more. Well, it shows up in punk rock songs and new wave songs in the late 70s, early 80s. And it shows up in films, particularly something like David Cronenberg's Videodrome. And this starts James Woods. And watch the sinister quality of the videotape in this next clip. I mean, you're thinking how can a videotape be sinister? And we're not talking the ring here of what's on it. We're talking about the physical tape itself.
What do you want from me? I want you to open up, Max. Open up to me. I've got something I want to play for you.
Oh my God!
Pretty danged weird. David Cronenberg, one of the highlights of the 1980s. His films always were pushing the envelope, making you think. This whole film was like a collusion between Marshall McLuhan, body horror, asks and makes you really think about, what is television doing to me? Another film that also asks these questions was Steven Soderbergh's film, Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And it's a film well worth watching. We're going to watch a scene here where there is this kind of shady character who comes along into these people's lives, and he has a collection of videotapes of women, interviews with women, and they get kind of degrading and such. And eventually he talks this woman who seems to have a good life into doing an interview, and then her husband, who's been cheating on her, watches it. And just look at the nature, the difference between the images of the husband watching and the videotaped image. The videotaped image already looks a bit like a horror film. It looks a bit like a found footage film 10 years before the found footage genre would become really important with the Blair Witch Project. Let's give this a watch.
Tell me your name.
Anne Bishop Mulaney.
So what do you want to talk about?
What do you usually talk about?
Sex.
Okay, let's talk about sex.
Do you have sex?
Not very often, no.
When you do, who usually initiates it?
He does.
Is the sex satisfying?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what you mean.
So, interestingly enough, Sex, Lies, and Videotape is often considered to be one of the very first independent films. And independent films would essentially be the lifeblood for interesting filmmaking throughout the 1990s. But then again, so is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. David Cronenberg was always doing his own thing, so he's not really part of that independent movement. But eventually it produced such people as the Coen brothers, Quentin Tarantino, and more. But that's all the 1990s, and we'll eventually get to discussing it. So what's happening is we're seeing things leading us into the 1990s. Sonic Youth and that noise, independent movies. And of course, the comic books would eventually create the world we're in today with Marvel Universe movies and all of that stuff. Another weird thing that was happening in that time was anime from Japan. Now, there was like the Transformers on television, and they had translated it for children so you could watch these things. But actually, in the 1980s, there was very little of this stuff. People tend to say, like, yeah, I got into anime back in the 1980s. No, you didn't. There's this article where this guy talks about what it was like to be an anime fan in the 1980s. You were totally underground. He said, these days, there might be 100 people who want to sign up for a ticket for some event for something. And he says, like back then, 100 people was the entirety of the anime world, the subculture in New York City in the 1980s. And I can testify this guy is absolutely right. Very few people. I used to work at Forbidden Planet in, say, 1986 and 1987. And we would get these Japanese comics, all in Japanese, that had images. We would get maybe, 40, 50 every month or two. And we had trouble selling them out. But what we didn't have trouble selling out was all the toys that were based on these things that were coming into the country. And the little robots. We have a whole toy section downstairs. But basically, that and manga. Manga is the Japanese comic books. These were things that, the book manga, you can see the cover here. This is the version I bought back then. And I used to go to this Japanese store, Kinokuniya, to buy and this was like part of the ritual of anyone who was into this stuff then, to buy these comics from Japan. None of them were translated. You didn't start getting translations of these things until the tail end of the 80s, and then the beginning of the 90s. I think the Akira books came out and started getting more and more of them in the 90s. And it's the 90s that's really the anime culture. If you listen to anyone talk about, yeah, I grew up watching anime, find out when they were a kid. I guarantee you it was the 1990s more than the 1980s, except for Transformers, and maybe there was one other thing. The anime books, the manga books, and when I say anime books, they would actually put color reproductions of an entire movie into a little, 5-inch by 6-inch book or so. But I used to get these. I've since weeded out my collection, but I still have, about 20, 30 of these from that period that I really liked. But it was underground. But what was interesting to me was the sense of artwork. People like Miyazaki were doing their early works in the 1980s. I really like this one. We're looking right now at something called Vampire Hunter D. Now, look at this imagery. And what I want you to notice is how unlike American comics and American cartoons this is. No muscular people. In fact, the main character, who's dressed a bit like a kind of a Puritan, is dressed as this elongated figure. And then you have these naked female figures, which you would never see in American cartoons, except, again, the heavy metal cartoons. But, anything coming, there was a Fritz the Cat animated feature, and then the heavy metal movie. But by and large, anything that looked with characters like this would be considered a Disney movie. And you would never, and to this day, you would never see a naked female body in a Disney cartoon. One of my favorites was called Angel and the Egg. And we're just going to watch a moment of that. And notice how unlike American films. Now, this is not your, transforming robots, Dragon Ball Z, action adventure anime. This is art. And it's very interesting art. And again, this was all underground. Eventually, anime and Japanese things would come overground. But let's watch Angel and the Egg a little bit right now. And finally, so far below the surface as to be almost invisible, and yet to me, perhaps the most important aspect of underground in the 80s, were the strange puppet films coming out of the Czech Republic and those influenced by Eastern Europe, the Brothers Quay. We're going to watch a little bit of Jan Schwankmayer's Alice. This is from the late 80s. And this is his Alice in Wonderland. And this is the Mad Hatter's Tea Party scene. You think you know it, but you don't. Schwankmayer is a surrealist. And I more than once I've heard people who back in Alaska, some genius had given a copy, probably watched it and said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do with this?" Taken a copy down to the library for their DVD collection. And more than once I'd heard someone say, "Yeah, we rented that to watch with our children." And it was so weird. Well, yes, it is. Easily the strangest version of Alice in Wonderland that I've ever heard of. But here's the fascinating things. Often the parents would be like scratching their heads, and the kids would love it, because kids actually do like stuff like this. Let's watch a little bit of Schwenkmeyer's Alice.
Why is a raven like a writing desk? Said the Mad Hatter.
And related to, but not necessarily so influenced by, Jan Schwenkmeyer is the brothers Quay. They live in London and have lived there for many years, but they're actually from the Philadelphia area in Pennsylvania. And they went there, and they actually were very inspired by Polish animation. And they also went to puppet theaters like the Tone Marionette Theater in Brussels, places I know very well now. Because of them, I, in a sense, made pilgrimages to see certain things that they talked about. But this is from a Polish book by Bruno Schulz, a strange Polish writer from the mid-20th century. And it's called Street of Crocodiles. And we're just going to watch a little bit of the early part of the movie. It's about 25 minutes long. Well worth seeing. But again, you'd have to like what you're about to see to watch it. This is not going to be easy watching by any means. It's going to make Jan Schwenkmeyer's Alice look like a walk in the park. But check this out. And notice the feeling of decay. And this feeling of decay shows up in Schwenkmeyer quite often too. The feeling of European decay. But I think, as we saw, there's a sense of decay in the American Gothic material of Tom Waits and Nick Cave. There's a sense of decay of the end of a society in so much of what we're hearing. The goth stuff. Not to be confused with American Gothic. American Gothic is a very different thing than goth music. Goth has always got this European angle, European darkness, castles, vampires and stuff, whereas American Gothic is about the decay of America, the insanity of America, the end of American culture. It is the opposite of the American normal sense of, it's the flip side of the normal sense of optimism that Americans have. But you can feel that sense of decay in the Quay brothers film as well. Watch a little bit of Street of Crocodiles with me. First of all, there's a lot of darkness in what was going on in the 1980s below the surface. A lot of darkness. So, in a sense, that darkness that we had seen in the 1970s continued sliding down. However, what was different than the 1970s was that, and it starts with things like disco at the end of the 70s, there's a culture above it completely oblivious to what's going on below it. Except, of course, in the case of people wanting to rescue their children from the music that they were dragging through the door. But one thing we can say about this, all of these different subcultures in the 1980s, is that in many ways it was a much more honest culture than the mainstream. Now, would I rather listen to MTV music from the 1980s, or would I rather listen to this stuff? Well, I gotta admit, certain types of this stuff are pretty darn scary, and I don't spend that much time. And by scary, I don't mean they're not scary for me personally. I don't go like, ooh, but rather philosophically, they're dark. So I don't necessarily spend much time with them. However, I can recognize them as being more honest products of what was really going on inside of people, particularly the youth and the people in their 20s and 30s who were just saying like, what's all this plastic stuff? What's all this superficial sheen? You know? It was also a rejection of any sense of a shared culture. The center is not holding. You know? That's why, one of the other reasons why, when we got to the end of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, people didn't rejoice because there was no more central culture. Besides the actual culture war, which I've talked about before, there was also the sense that so many people were in their own tribal stew and didn't care anymore about what was happening in the larger culture, including the Soviet Union and all of that. There was a rise of rage and anger. So much of this, not all of it, but so much of this music has a sense of anger and rage to it, particularly the hardcore and the metal music, who were almost like competing with each other. And I remember there was a point at the, about 1984, I worked at this very large record store in New York City called J&R Music World, and I was responsible for thousands of records. And, but in about 82 or so, I had opened up a couple new sections, and one was, there was a whole row for the new hardcore things, and then another one was a whole row for the new metal things. And they seemed to be just mushrooming and growing, all this new stuff that was filled with this intensity and rage. And then there was Michael Jackson. And, you know, Michael Jackson, I am sure with Thriller, sold more than all of these people put together. That is to say, take all the metal and all of the punk, hardcore, and post-punk, and all the rest of what we're talking about, and match it against just Thriller, and I am sure that Michael Jackson sold more. But it's all this stuff. I just pointed to someone and said, yeah, but for every Thriller, there's like 50, 60, 70 hardcore albums. In other words, there was just this undercurrent of stuff, and I knew it had to come up at some point. Also, we see the rise of tribalism. This is super important. And this tribalism comes down to us today, not quite in the same forms. For instance, the music acts don't necessarily hate each other the same way they did then. Part of it is because of what happened in the late 90s. But in the early 90s, one of the things that was happening was so many of these musical styles were being jammed together in new ways again through this kind of postmodern, alternative, noisy, strange culture that was brewing in the early 90s. But the tribalism has to do with an outlook of just like me against them. So, for instance, if you were into goth, you didn't like people who were into garage rock. You didn't like hardcore punks. You didn't like skaters. You didn't like, all those comic books, unless it was suddenly that's the 90s really, the Neil Gaiman Sandman comics suddenly appealed to goths. By that time, goth is becoming more of a commercial niche culture. It's becoming more of a geek culture as we see today. I would say most of these cultures, even the anime, none of these were geek cultures yet. They were underground obsessions. They were underground. They really were cultures that absorbed people in a big sort of way in their lives. That is to say, the cultures weren't big, but this took up your life. I mean, I have friends who were garage rockers. They lived and breathed garage rock. They tended to be the most. They cared more about the music of the past. They cared more about, they were the first ones I knew who rediscovered, for instance, blaxploitation films. And they used to love to watch these things and laugh at them because they were so silly. This was late 80s. They also rediscovered, they were there, they also liked rockabilly. And they liked certain kinds of country music and blues and such. They were like the people holding the archives of the past. They also tended to absolutely despise the new romantics or the goths or anything that was just, anything that claimed to be some sort of rock or pop that had no spine or guts to it whatsoever. So these tribes are, like if you were in the Deadhead tribe, you didn't cross over too far out of your tribe. Maybe you listened to Pearl Jam, which was kind of outside your tribe. This would be in the 90s. But you didn't go way over to the, you weren't listening to Green Day. That was too far of a stretch away from you. And I think the reason for tribalism, which is only going to grow in the early 90s, is that a loss of meaning. That which used to hold the society together no longer holds the society together. So not only is the Christian idea weak and dying, but so is the humanist idea. If you go back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, and you watch something like Lord Kenneth Clark's series on civilization, and he has this sense at the end of that series that it's perhaps too late to save civilization. But essentially that humanist civilization that values art, great works of art, music, great works of music, ballet, great plays. That culture is, in the 1980s, it's limping, it's dying. There is no more center. There are a few films, but again, it's often the blockbusters that everyone has to see. And those don't count. That's the new geek culture. So civilization, as we knew it, Western civilization is by this time dying. And so people are just drilling down into one little zone. So, who's watching the expressionist horror films of the 1920s? It's going to be the goths. The garage punks aren't going to watch that. There's no such thing. Now, I'm a different kind of an animal, obviously, because it's all mine. But then again, my feeling is as we were giving these things up and we were no longer discussing these things, there was that book by, I think it was Alan Bloom, what was it? I can't remember the name of it, but it was all about the loss of the canon in Western society and how it was being replaced with all these, the things coming out of political correctness. The Closing of the American Mind. I think that was the title of it. But, but that was already, the horse was already out of the barn. You're locking the horse. You're locking the barn, and the horse isn't coming back. So the question is, now we're digging in this new thing. Well, we're trying to get to where we are, so I'm not going to go too far into where we are. But it's a loss of meaning. Almost every one of these cultures is just dripping with a sense of loss and fatigue and sorrow and rage and meaninglessness. And they're trying to generate it through art. I find it fascinating that the people who live for music the most are shredding music down to pure noise. It's fascinating. You kill the thing you love. But it's also a search for a culture through subcultures. Interestingly enough, that there's a lot of neo-paganism in this. Whether it's the Neo-Hippies who are, just look back at the 60s as having the summer of love, man. They don't even recognize that the whole thing failed. See my earlier 1960s episode. Or you have people like the Nordic paganism of the metal scene, and these kinds of things. They're searching because the center does not hold. And I can see someone today saying, well, this whole underground in the 1980s, that's kind of interesting, but it's just so dark. This doesn't have much to do with us today. I mean, now it's all about, the social justice left versus the kind of mocking right or whatever. That's how some people see it like that. How does this relate to us today? Well, for one thing, those are tribes. And they tend to hate the people on the other side. Don't be like them. But the other thing is that people don't see that it is these things. It is this, it's what Blixa Bargeld said. You have to destroy for something new to come. And that's what's happening. The ground is being scythed. The wheat is being harvested, except it's all being burned. No one is making something out of the past. They are just simply throwing it into the fire. That's why it's interesting that Blixa Bargeld would join up with Nick Cave for something more meaningful. Because you can't live with this sense of meaninglessness. In a sense, the stuff is dark. The stuff is over. But then again, no, it's not. Let me explain what happened. All of this stuff from the late 80s, from the 80s, underground, was brought up to become the 90s culture. That's the next episode. And then the 90s culture was suddenly taken and shoved into the internet. And that's where we are. So what you'll find is, for instance, the messages that were sung in the 90s, these, end up being the political correctness of today. It's all pushed in and then disseminated globally. The tribes now exist on blog sites. They exist on Twitter feeds. They exist on Facebook timelines. That's where this all went. This is still here everywhere. The sense of rage, the sense that people can't talk to each other. When I read someone, and Tim Pool recently had a real left-winger on his IRL podcast, and he was interviewing him and asking him tough questions. But so many other people in the comments were saying things like, we shouldn't even be listening to this guy. That's the tribal aspect. It's the rage as well. It's the people who, as soon as they hear something they dislike, they go like, well, this person really needs to be red-pilled. It's that kind of stuff. It's that sense of like, how are we letting this person come onto the campus and speak these right-wing fascist ideas? It all goes back to punk rock. It all goes back to hardcore. It all goes back to metal. It all goes back to comics. It all goes back. We're living in the same world. It's just been pushed and spread. It's like trying to kill cockroaches. Stuff doesn't die. They just go into the walls. And in our case, they're digital walls. Okay. I am sure, however long this edits out to be, it's going to be another epic. And next time we do the next episode of How We Got Here, it's going to be the first half of the 90s. So the first half of the 90s is going to be a continuation of Underground in the 80s. I'll see you then. Meanwhile, share, subscribe, like, bell icon, contribute, please. There's a PayPal link. You can donate to the channel. Blah, blah, blah. Tired. It took a long time. Well, thanks for listening. And I hope to see you again. Well, I haven't seen any of you. I've seen photos of you. I haven't seen you. I hope you'll see my digital image at some point in the near future. And I hope I've given you a little bit more food for thought. From Tbilisi, this is Burn saying, Nakwamdis. See you later.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.